Chapter 15. Bazaar's Bazaar. Going out, said Daniel. Silver gave a nod. Come if you like. Eager to explore Manhattan, Daniel was across the room in a few bounds, pulling on his coat and gloves and scarf. Together they set off into the night. As it turned out, sightseeing was not on the agenda. It became clear that Mr. Silver was on the hunt again for his elusive treasure. He limped a couple of steps ahead of Daniel, barely speaking as they charged along streets carved like canyons through the enormous buildings. Central Park. Among all the suffocating concrete and glass and fog, it seemed like the last green place on earth. Mr. Silver pointed out the famous Plaza Hotel, an enormous building that looked like a grand castle. 8 blocks later, they swung into an alley where the steam from restaurant kitchens glowed in the light of the moon. They walked until they reached a plain brown door. At first glance, it seemed to be the back entrance to a store or cafe or hotel. But then Daniel spotted something. 2 words carved into the door frame above the door, the sort of thing that would only be noticed by those searching for it. Bazaar's Bazaar. Silver leaned in and opened the door. The shop beyond was a dark and dingy cave, half lit by the soft flickering glow of hundreds of dribbling candles. The air was soup thick. Mr. Silver had packed the nowhere Emporium with many trinkets and objects picked up on his travels, props he called them, that would never be sold, but created the illusion of a regular store. You could spend hours looking and always spot something you'd never seen. But Bazaar's Bazaar must have contained 100 times the amount of treasures. Coats of armours glistened, swords and shields hung on great racks. There were jars of pickled animals, powders, lotions, potions, cages containing ravens and snakes and spiders the size of Daniel's fist. At the far end of the store stood a counter, and behind the counter sat a middle-aged man with greasy, receding hair and a long, waxy face. His eyes seemed too large for his head, and one of them pointed inwards, while the other fixed on his customers. "You looking for something particular?" he said in a voice rough as dead tree bark. "As a matter of fact," said Mr. Silver. He leaned in and whispered something in the man's ear. At first the shopkeeper did not respond. He sat back in his chair and reached under his desk, and when he brought his hand back up, it held a large onion. He raised the onion to his mouth and took a bite, skin and all, as if it were a juicy apple. "You're in luck, friend," the shopkeeper said, onion juice dripping from his yellow teeth. Silver took a sharp intake of breath. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened his eyes, there was a spark in them that Daniel had never seen before. "Show me." The shopkeeper's yellowing eyes lingered on Silver's dusty old suit. "You realise," he said, "that the item in question will not be cheap?" "Show me!" roared Silver, and he brought his fist down on the counter with such force that Daniel actually jumped. The shopkeeper nodded and cowered and turned away, disappearing down a set of stairs somewhere behind the desk. There was much banging and clattering from an unseen room, and after several minutes he reappeared, carrying a thin wooden box decorated with intricate carvings. Mr. Silver took it in his hands and turned his back to both Daniel and the shopkeeper. A pause. Daniel heard the box snap shut, and Silver spun round. His face was blank, but there was a light dancing somewhere deep in his eyes. "I'll take it," he said, and he reached into his coat and pulled out a huge wad of $100 bills, held together with a golden clip. He tossed the money onto the desk. It was more money than Daniel had ever seen or imagined, and he watched the shopkeeper's eyes widen and his face become a mask of avarice and hunger. He dropped his raw onion to the floor and wiped the drool from the corner of his mouth, scooping up the money and cradling it in his hands like a baby. "Do we have a deal or don't we?" Silver asked impatiently. "Oh, yes," said the shopkeeper, and he held out a long hand that was both the colour and texture of blue-veined cheese. "We have a deal, all right. We have a deal."